Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Hunter O'Hanian. I'm the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archive here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We're very happy to have all of you here, and we're very happy to welcome tonight's guest, Robert Jones Jr. Hello, Robert. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we're happy to see you. Where are we finding you this evening?
I am in Brooklyn, New York, in my home that I share with my husband. We've been here now for quite a number of years in the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn.
Great. And how far away from your house did you grow up?
Actually quite close. I grew up in Bushwick, at least for the first 6 years of my life, which is a hop, skip, and a jump. It's the neighborhood over. But then for the bulk of my life, it's pretty far. It's the southern tip of Brooklyn. I grew up on the border of Bensonhurst and Gravesend, which is not too far from Coney Island, for people who need some reference. So yeah, that's about an hour away by subway.
Yeah. Well, but it's wonderful that you've actually are so close to the place that you grew up in, a place that you feel, at least it's familiar, if not always comfortable, but a place that feels close to you.
Oh, I absolutely adore Brooklyn. I don't think I could live anyplace else.
Wonderful. Well, we are very happy to have you here today and talk about your book, The Prophets. As I was saying to you in the pre-show, I think this is the last piece of fiction that I read. And so it's really just, it was an amazing book. And it's got so many accolades. And I want to talk about what brought you to this book. And then we're going to get to do a reading from the book. You are. And then also talk about sort of what post the prophet's life has been like as well too. And so it'll be great to have that conversation. I want to say hello to my colleague, Paula Sierra, who's there behind the scenes. Hello, Paula. Hello. Nice to see you. And we're happy to have you. Paula is our digital asset manager at Stonewall. And so what that means is that Paula does two important things. She oversees the digitization of our archives, which we're deep in the process of making that happen and making them available to people around the country or the world. And then also, of course, she's in charge of all of our digital engagement as well, too. And so thank you, Paula, for all of your help here. For those of you who are just joining us the first time, a little bit about Stonewall. We've been around for nearly 50 years. We're located here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And even though we have the name Stonewall, we are in no way connected to the Stonewall Inn other than in an aspirational way. We were founded by a gentleman by the name of Mark Silber, who was from New York, but his family relocated to Hollywood, Florida. And he realized he was gay when he was about 18 or 19 years old. And he was looking around for gay books about things that he could read about who he was and who his community was. And he ended up with a small group of books about this big. And in his room, he collected those books. And he called that bookshelf Stonewall, because with his New York base in 1973, he had heard about the Stonewall uprising. And so it was very prescient of him at the time to actually realize that this was something that was going to change people's lives in many ways. Of course, his name is Mark Silber. He's alive and living in Philadelphia and very happy. But today, what started as a bookshelf this big now has 28,000 volumes in it. It is the largest LGBTQ library in the world. Most of the titles, of course, you can find in any major metropolitan library, but the power is to see all of them together in the same room. And so we continue to collect them. If you have donations, if you have books that you would like to donate to the library, we'll be very happy to take them. We were recently in conversation with a gay historian by the name of Jonathan Ned Katz. And Jonathan, of course, is a wonderful historian. And all of his books are coming to the Stonewall Library. And so that's wonderful as well, too. In addition, we have an archive. And our archive is 2,700 linear feet. And when I first started Stonewall, I really didn't know what that meant. But 2,700 linear feet equals about 6 million pieces of paper. And that would be single space all the way up one side of the Empire State Building and all the way down the other. It's serials, it's individual papers, it's periodicals, it's you name it. And we are probably the third largest gay archive in the US. New York has the Fales Library, NYU, and the one of the New York Public Library. The Lesbian History Archive is, of course, amazing. The Leather Archive in Chicago, the One Archive at USC is amazing. And so these are resources of LGBTQ culture, which as we struggle our way through this next wave of culture wars and having to re-identify ourselves, it's important to understand that there are repositories of LGBTQ culture out there that people are fighting to be sure that the work is collected, that it's preserved, and that it is interpreted and presented to the general public. So to find out about us, of course, go to stonewall-museum.org, and you can find everything about it that we have in our collection. We also do exhibitions. And the exhibitions really are, they come out of our library and our archive. We have two up right now. We have one exhibition called Misinformation, which is looking at the not so true facts that came out in the early days of HIV and AIDS in 1981 through the mid-80s, and comparing it to the misinformation that we've seen in the last 2 years about the COVID pandemic. And so it's been fascinating to watch how the same tropes and the same things have been repeated over and over again. We also have an exhibition up called Outright, which Outright, for those of you who don't know, was an LGBTQ writers conference that was first in San Francisco and then in Boston in the 1990s. And there were major speeches that were made and presentations that were made that really led to the explosion of LGBTQ writing in the 1990s that then led to what could actually create a situation where we have 30,000 gay books in the same room. So we've highlighted 10 of the presentations and then paired them with contemporary writers today. And so that we can see the influence that we're seeing on younger writers as well too. So that show, well, I think the opening for that will be next week, but the show is up on the walls. And so if you're here in South Florida, you can come visit us there. We have another exhibition up called Queer History, which is on the campus of Nova Southeastern University. It's probably one of the largest exhibitions that we've ever done. Over 125 objects are in that show, and it traces LGBTQ history through papers and through serials and periodicals from 1937 to the present day. And so that will be up until the first week of June. And then we probably have, I think as last count, we have 27 exhibitions going up all over the United States for Pride Month this year. Everybody's really like, now that sort of this COVID thing is feeling like to some people it's over, although I keep on reading about these resurgences, but from Toledo to San Francisco to New York to all over Florida, we've been getting requests, and so we've been filling them as fast as we possibly can to be able to provide information about shows. We're doing a show actually here in the main Fort Lauderdale Library. We'll be opening at the end of the month called Banned Books, Free Books, and we're looking at the top LGBTQ banned books from 2021, the top 5 out. The American Library Association keeps a list of banned books. And every year they publish a list of the top 10 banned books, and 5 of those are LGBTQ books. So we're featuring those books in that exhibition. And the free book part is that we have so many duplicate copies of books and we've been getting so many requests for gay books that we now create what we call LGBTQ library starter kits. And so we curate boxes of books and then send them out to classrooms all over the United States as well too. And I think that will be something that will be necessary over the next number of years. We just had a big corporate sponsor sign on today who wants to cover all the shipping of those books, which I think is just like, again, it's so generous that people realize the importance of getting this information out to people. And so it's wonderful. So this series we started back in the beginning of COVID. All these programs have been preserved on YouTube and also on our website. Give us about 36 hours, and you'll find it on the website if you have somebody who has not been able to see tonight's talk, and you can see the other talks there as well. You can, of course, sign up at stonewall-museum.org to get our email list to see what's going on. I want to do a thank you to our friends at the Our Fund Foundation because they're the ones who help provide support to make this series available. And so thank you to all of you there as well, too. Just how tonight's going to work. If you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. Just throw your comments into the chat or the Q&A, and we will be monitoring all of that as well too. And I kind of think that's it for what we have to do going forward. So Robert, hello, nice to see you again.
Pleasure.
Yeah, so let's talk about the pink tie and the pink braces.
I wanted to step outside of traditional masculinity and recall a time when pink used to be for men and blue was for women.
Yeah.
Just to, illustrate how arbitrary these confines are.
All boys aren't blue.
That's right. I have that book on my shelf, as a matter of fact.
So that your point about that is very well taken. Just to read a quick quote from the New York Times. In your 1985 essay, Here Be Dragons, James Baldwin wrote, "At bottom, what I have learned was that the male desire for male roams everywhere, avid, desperate, unimaginably lonely. America's attitudes about sexuality," he added, "are tragically, inexorably linked with its ideals of hypermasculinity and radicalized violence." And of course, that is a part of what the Prophets is based on. It's part of what your thinking is, and that wonderful James Baldwin quote. But tell us a little about your background and how you got to this book. You're fortunate in the sense that in 2021, a major novel came out under your name. You've been writing for years, doing great work, and so you have a major book. But sort of what got you to that point? How did that happen?
James Baldwin is partly to thank. As a matter of fact, the very first piece of Baldwin brilliance that I ever read was Here Be Dragons. I read that in freshman year of college and was transformed by it. Here was this Black queer man from New York City who's this brilliant writer, all of the things that I wanted or hoped to be. And I immediately adopted him as my spiritual godfather after having been heartbroken to learn that he had passed away. And I committed myself to this idea that I would write. It is something that I had always had a passion for since I was a boy. I think the first thing that I wrote, I was 6 years old, and I was writing a story about Wonder Woman in which I was her sidekick. If that didn't tell you I was queer, I don't know what would have.
Basically, what you mean is you queered up Batman and Robin.
That's essentially what I did. I never thought of it in those terms, but yes. And I never really thought of myself as a writer, even though I had become increasingly good at it, that I found it to be increasingly fulfilling.
Did you have writers or readers around you as a kid? Were there people who emphasized books and knowledge and the ability to create in that way?
Well, my mother read to me often when I was a child, and my father was the first person to buy me my first comic books, and I've been collecting comic books for 46 years now. So yes, in a sense. And then also, I come from a family of artists who never realized their purpose. My mother, a seamstress, my father, a musician, my grandfather, a dancer, like my aunt, a singer. There were people in my family who never really realized their talents because we were scrambling to survive.
And this is in Brooklyn, right?
And this is in Brooklyn. And, art didn't pay the bills.
Right.
So my grandfather, who was an amazing tap dancer, worked as in a steam press. And my grandmother, who was an amazing seamstress, worked in a factory. And my mother worked for a bank, and so on and so forth. So I never imagined that, even though I found my gift in this writing, that it was something that I could really prioritize. So I always treated it as a hobby and not as a purpose. But
you able to share, as a child, were you able to share your interest in writing or reading with other peers, either siblings or other children that you knew at the time? Or was it a very solitary journey?
it was quite solitary, in fact, except in the case of my fourth grade teacher, Mr. Howard Firestone, who told me that he believed that I had a great talent. And so I carried that with me for a long time, but I did keep my writing to myself because it was, even then, quite personal. I'm writing at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. It was still very personal about my life. So it was quite solitary, in fact.
So continue as you went along. And
so as I went along, I didn't realize that my life was a worthy subject for creative evaluation until I was about 16 years old, and I read Terry McMillan's first book, Mama. And that really transformed for me what literature could do. Of course, in school I was reading, Death of a Salesman and Glass Menagerie and, all of these other books that did not quite feel connected to my life as a young Black person growing up in Brooklyn. But reading Terry McMillan's Mama did, in fact, connect and made me dream about what I was capable of in terms of this craft. And so that was when I started to take writing a bit more seriously. But it's not until years and years later, at the ripe old age of 31, that I decided to pursue it as my one true purpose, after hearing a gentleman on Oprah say something to the effect of, you know what your purpose is, you've been avoiding it all of your life, and all you have to do is, you don't have to worry about the end result, just take the next step that's required for you to manifest this purpose. And that next step for me was getting a degree in creative writing. And so I left everything behind to move back home with my mother and go back to school and pursue creative writing.
so was that your undergraduate degree?
That was my undergraduate degree. I received
from Brooklyn College?
a Bachelor of Fine Arts at Brooklyn College. And I was afraid to go back to school because I was so much older. I was 31. I had anticipated that all of my classmates would be 18 and be wondering, what was I doing here? But in fact, that was not what happened. What happened was there were so many other people my age and older. And I think the reason for that is because one of the lessons I learned was it was better for me to get my degree at 31 than at 18, because at 18, I had no idea what I wanted to do. But at 31, I did. And it's in that final year of undergrad where I decide I'm going to write a novel. And I'm going to write a novel about something that I have never seen before. And what is that? That is, how come I never see Black queer people during antebellum slavery? It begins during the Harlem Renaissance. So Wallace Thurman wrote The Blacker the Berry in 1929. That's the earliest I've ever seen Black queerness referenced outside of rape culture or some sort of sexual assault. And I wanted to write about that. So I started researching, seeing if I could find anything in the canon whatsoever. And it was always under the context of sexual assault. And my question was, well, what about love? And Toni Morrison said once, if you cannot find the book you wish to read, then you must write it. And so I said, gosh darn it, I'm going to have to imagine this wholesale and write it. And 14 years later, The Prophets.
Yeah. And of course, it's such a wonderful inspirational story in the sense, if there's something that we want and we don't see, that we need, that we yearn for, and it's not there, what role can we play in being able to create it? And you have done that. I mean, the idea, of course, using Toni Morrison's advice there, but the idea of seeing that if something is not possible, or if something is not there, that doesn't mean it's not possible. It means it's on us to be able to fulfill it. And you've really sort of proven that. What'd you do in that period between high school and by the time you were 30? I'm not looking for any dirt here. I'm just sort of curious. How did you spend your time as a young man?
Menaced. If I was not being menaced because I was Black, I was being menaced because I was queer. And so I was trying to survive. I was working. I worked at Toys R Us for 10 years. I worked for Bank of America for 4 years. And I was basically living day to day, just trying to survive, trying to make it in a world that I felt did not have a place for me. And it was really in writing that I found solace and safety, as well as fulfillment.
In that period, were you still reading? Were you keeping a journal? Were you still engaged with words during that period?
I kept a journal in my teen years. In fact, I found them not too long ago and cringed at some of the things I was writing. But I also wrote
were you cringing at style or content?
Both. I was always very candid, and sometimes embarrassingly so. So I was doing that, and I was also writing really bad poetry. And so I remained engaged, and I kept reading. I had not yet encountered the greats, the Baldwins and the Morrisons of the world, but I did continue to read because also in that way I found a great deal of inspiration. Yes.
And so still trying to stick with your time in high school and early 20s, who were the gay influencers? I mean, what were you reading? What were you looking at? You describe a period in which there was isolation and that you were a Black queer man, a young Black queer man, and from a working class family, but yet artist within that family. But then in your own way, there had to be some parts of the gay community that you were sort of reaching out to. What was that? Whether it was just by reading, or we were talking about going to the village when you were young and doing different things, whether it was ballroom culture. I mean, tell us what it was like for you to be a young man without position, without permission, sort of being out there in the world.
It was really difficult because, as far as I could tell, no one that I knew was queer. Oh. Other than maybe a friend or two of my mother's who were much older than I was at the time. I'm like 14, 15, 16 years old in the 80s. And always the most flamboyant and obvious. And so I wasn't quite sure if I could trust these older people to kind of mentor me and let me know what this world was like.
Now you don't mean you don't mean they were wearing pink ties and fuchsia spats, do you?
Child, they were giving me life with the makeup and the sequins and it, think Sylvester.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, my mother's friend Junior, God rest his soul, was very much like Sylvester. Or even when I was a young, I used to maybe think that Prince might have been gay because of his androgynous, sometimes really feminine way of being.
Right.
But I happened to stumble upon Greenwich Village one evening, coming home from the movies, because I used to go to the movies by myself when I was younger. And this is Greenwich Village in 1985. So AIDS is still very prevalent and scary. But there's also this sort of act up resistance to trying to shove Black people, gay, queer people back into the closet. So I stumble upon Christopher Street and I make my way to the pier, and my mind is absolutely blown by what I'm seeing. And I mean, I don't mean that as a pun, although you could take it as one.
I didn't take it that way. I mean, we'll contextualize this in a second, but keep going.
Because I'm 16 years old and I'm seeing things quite raw that I had never seen before. Because for people who don't know, the pier during this time was a place where queer people went to literally be themselves because they had no other place to be themselves. And that included sexual engagement right there out in the open.
Yeah, so just to put this in context, if you're not familiar with this period in New York City's history, probably Jonathan Weinberg's book, The Piers, is probably one of the best places to go to. But you know, if you took Christopher Street, kept on going west, there were a series of dilapidated piers. Now, those piers were very active up until about the 1950s. Airlines actually, and LaGuardia and air travel made that part of New York go into decline. But up until that time, Cunard and all the other big steamboats, they brought their boats there. It was a very vibrant area. But in the 50s and the 60s, it went into decline. The gay community blossomed in Greenwich Village in the 1960s. And then you have these abandoned piers now that are just blocks away on the other side of the West Side Highway there. And what Robert's talking about is it was debauchery from a gay male sexual standpoint at that time. I have to be quiet so people get to see Robert laughing here. So, but it was a very important moment in this sort of late 60s, post-Stonewall 70s, pre-AIDS period, where there was this feeling of empowerment and enlightenment among the gay community, certainly questioning many things as well too. But of course, this is where people like Peter Hujar and David Wojnarowicz and sort of many artists really they were out there experiencing what was happening.
Indeed. And my 16-year-old self saw these things and was at once intrigued and horrified, and started to make friends. And that's when I kind of started to understand myself as a member of a much larger community than I thought, and made so many mistakes, stumbled so often along the way of trying to navigate two lives, essentially. So I'm able to be my full self when I'm on Christopher Street, and I have to be a completely different person when I'm at home. But that was my introduction into the world of queer people. And understanding things like the balls and the houses and all of those sorts of things, which I never really got into, but knew quite a number of the people who were into those things. And I want to say that it was lovely, but all I can remember is the heartbreak.
Mm.
Because sometimes, when a society tells you that you're worthless, people internalize that and they carry it with them and they give it as gifts to everyone around them. And so often that happened in these queer spaces where, I meet someone and I think, oh, we could start dating and I could have a boyfriend, like, all my friends in high school have boyfriends or girlfriends. And that was never the case. It was always something that went as far as lust and no further. And that started to chip away at my self-esteem. And so I learned lessons, and some of them were really, really hard ones.
And it's such a wonderful way of hearing that and understanding that story and the impact. And again, today, when in 2022, when we see laws being passed about suppressing one's sexual orientation or one's gender identity, all we can imagine, all of those of us who've been through this in the past can imagine, is that it's not transactional, but it is just so deep. It will be so deep in the grains of the generations coming behind us that they live in a time in which who they are is just being repressed. And we will see the results of that 20 or 30 years from now.
Indeed, we will.
Yeah.
And I weep for the coming generations if we don't do something now to prevent this.
Right. Well, so this was my 3-minute introduction. We've had a nice question here, but so I know you have a couple of excerpts of the book pulled aside. So let's get to the first excerpt to do a reading. And for those who are not familiar with the book, can I just ask you to sort of set up factually sort of what's going on at this point?
Yes. So the prophets is the story of Samuel and Isaiah, two enslaved young men who are in love on a plantation in 19th century Mississippi. And the book revolves around how that love transforms, inspires, angers, uproots everything and everyone around them. And in the particular chapter that I'm reading from, it's called Amos. And Amos is sort of one of the antagonists of the book, a fellow enslaved person who is now coming to realize the nature of Samuel and Isaiah's relationship and the dangers he thinks it could pose. And so he wants to sort of interfere or convince them that what they're doing, they should not be doing. And that's where I am going to begin reading from.
Thank you.
The barn was dark. Inside, there were nothing but the horses and two twisted shadows on the ground. Two shadows twisted together on the ground. Yes, Amos had seen strange things, but this beat all. He was astonished by how obvious it was, by how easily it could be missed by those who weren't curious enough to seek the answer right in front of them, because the answer, even when revealed, remained unbelievable. He had thought their kinship merely hazardous at first, never thinking it wise for any two people to be so close. Not here, anyway. Even with Essie, his embrace was with one arm only. The other arm had to be free to cry into the crook of when the warmth of other bodies turned cold. It hadn't occurred to him until the veil was lifted and the world was clearer to him what Samuel and Isaiah's peculiar closeness meant. In the absence of women, he understood the necessity of turning to a hand or a hog, or, in a last-ditch effort, begrudgingly and with falsehoods intact, the uncleanliness of other men. Hot was hot, and release for a man was always imminent, excepting unto death. But to not have a desire for women to begin with, to produce no physical response to them whatsoever, above all, to willingly choose a male to cradle you gently into sleep, even when the women were as soft and abundant as cotton. Amos shook his head to clear the image from his mind. Man on top of woman, that wasn't just Christ-like, it was sensible, right? He asked the question, but rhetorically, because he was apprehensive and uncertain about an answer. There was no suitable name for whatever it was that Samuel and Isaiah were doing, at least none that he could remember. That he couldn't remember bothered him as much as the act itself. They weren't women. Women were weak, and by God's design. Nevertheless, by carrying on as though at least one of them was female, they threatened to only further diminish what Amos imagined had already been diminished to death. For Samuel and Isaiah to wear their sex this way, dewy, firm, trembling, free, even under the cloak of night, was folly. If they had cared at all for any of the others, they would have, at the very least, masked their strangeness, hushed it better, goddammit, so that Bob wouldn't discover it. Didn't they understand that here, under Paul's word, they were nobodies? Hold on. They were bodies. They were in bodies. They just had no authority over theirs. Amos could look at the embracing shadows no more, especially the one he carried from the wagon all those years ago. Can you even imagine that? Someone throwing a child into a wagon as simply as you would a sack of cotton? A child screaming and his parents being beat into the ground for daring to protest. He was impressed, though, that the boy survived the trip. A little woozy at the end of it, of course, what with the way food and water were rationed and how the insects bit. But Amos ignored his heavy shackles to catch the boy before he passed out in the dirt. Holding him, he wondered what it might be like to have his own child, to hold him close to his chest, that the baby might be tickled by the coils of his father's hair. And looking down at son would look up at father, smile and tug at the strands of his beard so that they would both be glad. He began walking back to his cabin. Avoiding the lantern light of the patrollers in the distance, he traced his steps, recalling that he had seen Samuel and Isaiah often since they were boys, mostly near the barn and therefore mostly segregated from the others. One black, the other purple, one smiling, the other brooding. Maybe if someone had carried him, weak-kneed, off a wagon, Samuel might be a son too. You knew? Amos asked folk. He paid close attention to their whispers. The women were thankful for the reprieve, the others grateful for their courage. Maggie said it was something old from the other time before the ships and guns came. Amos knew of no such thing. He didn't even have to ask Essie because her and Isaiah's shared laughter now made sense. But there wasn't anything funny. He didn't understand how she didn't connect Isaiah's failure to Paul's. Paul. Amos knew that once Paul discovered the nature of Isaiah and Samuel's stubbornness was something other than bad aim, they would inspire a passion in him that would become uncontainable. At some point, Paul's restless mind wouldn't be content with just the two of them. He would seek to inspect the others, to find increasingly creative and heartbreaking methods of preventing Samuel and Isaiah's unholiness from spreading. Because of those two, suffering would prosper. Amos felt spite growing in the midpoint of his ribs, even though it was well known that Samuel and Isaiah inspired everything around them to dance. Some old folk, the children, flies, the tips of tall grass, everything except the black-eyed Susans, which turned their heads up at whomever. Skeptical by nature, they swayed a little when the boys walked past, but never any more than that. They were secure enough in the golden of their petals that they didn't have to worship anything else except maybe the rain, shout when she came down. Amos wished his people could be more like that. When he himself saw them together, now that he saw them, frolicking in the marsh, hefting bales of hay, and tending to the animals, or just sitting silently, side by side, with their backs against the barn, feeding each other with bare hands, feet too close together, he nearly glorified their names. He covered his eyes because Isaiah and Samuel were bright, encoded in the shining, the likes of which he had never seen. A shame that he would have to be the one to smash it.
Did Amos, Samuel, and Isaiah love each other?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that was certainly the sense that I had from that. And of course, that's why that last part of it is so powerful. So can you bring those, well, first of all, in that passage, what year are we talking about? 1850, 1825? Remind me.
Intentionally vague about time.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because this book is from the perspective of enslaved people who would have had very different concepts of time, given that they didn't know when they were born. They were not allowed to read or write. They moved only according to the slave owners' whims and wishes. And so time for them would operate differently. 1825, 1830, 1835 would hold no meaning for them. And so I have a sense in my head about what year this is, but for the purposes of the narrative, I wanted it to be unclear because it would have been unclear to the enslaved.
Yes, because of course you put those of us as readers in that same situation that you were putting the characters in.
Yes.
But now from that point, which of course is, as you say, is not set in a particular period, can you imagine those three characters today in 2022? What is the 2022 version of those three characters, of two men who were in love and frolicking and enjoying themselves, bringing joy to everything and everyone around them, and then a third character who loved them and respected them, but not in the same way that those two loved each other, and had to deal with something that was profoundly conflicting for him. Can you imagine that situation with three people today in 2021 at that same age group?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, how I imagine it would play out now is that a pastor would tell his congregation that what Samuel and Isaiah are doing is against the will of God, and that they should be stricken from the record, from the church, from scripture. If they didn't repent, they should be excommunicated, which would inspire the congregation and the larger society to treat Samuel and Isaiah as disposable. And we see that every day, in particular now with transgender women. The ways in which violence is enacted upon them is so disgusting that it's almost unspeakable. So we see it very clearly in the here and now.
Yeah, and that's what I was struck with too, in the sense that the situation that you described, not quite 200 years ago, but well over a century ago, we can imagine that same situation happening today. And as it relates to race and sexual orientation and gender identity, that it is the same thing that we see every day.
It is one of the greatest and most tragic legacies of this country is how little we've grown from these periods of great oppression. Certainly the names have changed and the locations have changed, but the underlying pathologies remain entrenched.
Just go to any neighborhood in Brooklyn or Los Angeles or Detroit or, this story, or New Orleans or in Miami, this story plays out all the time, every day.
Over and over again.
Yeah, and the role of institutions, it seems to me at least, is still as powerful today in molding people's lives as it was nearly 200 years ago in what you wrote about.
I mean, we just know from the US Supreme Court leak for Roe versus Wade what the agenda of the conservative wing of the court is. It's to undermine and undo any progress this country has made over the last 100 years.
It's just crazy, crazy. Just as an aside, everybody, if you're not registered to vote, please do so. And please be sure that you make plans to vote. And please make sure that you have everybody in your family, that you help them to vote. And also that whatever roadblocks are put up in the way, that you overcome those. And so that, because people will put roadblocks up. Just a little bit personal aside there. So let's talk about, so when did you start writing this book?
I started writing The Prophets, which the original name of The Prophets was Sing Hannibal, Bear Witness. And it was going to be a fictionalized slave narrative where Hannibal, who eventually became Isaiah, was going to be recounting his story to someone who was recording it for posterity. He was going to recount his life and his love affair with Samuel and everything they endured. But I kept running into roadblocks, and I started this in 2006.
Okay.
This was my first year of grad school. And I was running into roadblocks because Isaiah's point of view did not permit particular bits of knowledge that I wanted to communicate. So I thought perhaps give Samuel a point of view as well. And I kept running into that same problem. And the problem only resolved itself when I gave several of the characters points of view, as well as ancestral voices, points of view. And those ancestral voices led me back to the before time in Africa, which I think broadened the scope and gave a greater context for the Black queer experience. So it was 2006 when I first started writing what would become The Prophets.
And when did you get, what year were you able to get a contract for the book?
2019.
Yeah.
It was May of 2019.
And of course, that was the first time that then it probably felt like, oh my God, this is real. I have a contract for this book.
You know, it honestly didn't even feel real then. It did not feel real until my editor, Sally Kim, during an interview, during a Buzz panel, held up my book and said, "Here it is."
Huh?
And I broke down into tears.
Of course I would too.
And that was the first time that it felt real to me. Yeah.
So what's it been like afterwards?
Surreal in this way. So much of my time as an author has been spent in virtual spaces.
Yeah.
Because of the pandemic. So I not until very recently, I did not have the opportunity to go to bookstores and meet with booksellers in person and readers in person and sign books and all of those things. That wasn't until this spring that I first got to do that. So for a long time, it felt as though I was watching someone named Robert Jones Jr. become a celebrated author, that I was just someone in the audience watching what was transpiring.
Yeah.
And right this very moment, I still feel a little bit disconnected from the experience. But at the same time, ready to fully embrace myself as a full-time author.
Well, I mean, I think that's amazing. But, you know, I mean, just to let people know, I mean, if you just Google Robert and you look at the awards and the mentions, and I don't mean to embarrass you by saying this, but it is really somewhat profound that the book has received so much recognition out there. It's a wonderful thing. But as I look at this list, I sort of think like, how does one get prepared for this, particularly for somebody with your background, in the sense that this is something you've been working on since graduate school, as you say, and then it just took off. It just took off in this amazing way, and we can blame it on the circumstances with COVID or everything else, but I just want to acknowledge it, that it's this rocket that you have gotten on, and it's. And I guess I would just want to ask the quick question again: how does it feel to be riding that rocket?
It's hard to internalize it.
Yeah.
I am. Maybe this is a trauma response, but I don't do very well with accepting blessings.
Yeah.
I am programmed to accept or expect bad things to happen. So when good things happen, I'm not exactly sure what to do with them. And so my response to the success of the prophets is me now strategizing how I can ensure that the next project is as good or better than the prophets. So I'm not even, it's really hard to even allow myself to stand aside and say, Robert, you accomplished something that many people find has value. It's really difficult to do that.
Of course, it's difficult to not try to compare the next project in terms of success as opposed to the art of it from one to the other, and sort of getting all that shit out of your head and just saying, I'm going to make the next project whatever it is that I want that next project to be. And I mean, I find personally, and also with other people, sometimes after a major success like this, like to prepare for things that can be perceived as bombs, you know, for 2 or 3 in a row, and then things will happen happen after that, because it just becomes sometimes it becomes unrealistic because it's outside of the art at that point. It's the structure that actually makes all that stuff happen. So
that's all I want to be. I want to be a better writer tomorrow than I am today. That's it.
Which is great. I know you have another passage, and I think we have time for that as well too. And folks, if you have questions, now's the time to throw them into the chat or the Q&A. And I do want to say hello to all of our friends out there on Facebook. I see there are lots of people out there as well. And if you have someone who's interested in this talk and they're not here right now, just give us about 36 hours and it will be up on our website at stonewall-museum.org. You'll be able to see the full talk. And of course, it will be up there and YouTube and Facebook and all the other usual places. So Robert, reading number 2.
Reading number 2 is from a chapter called Song of Songs. And as I mentioned previously, parts of the prophets go back to a before time in Africa where queerness was considered part of the landscape and not something that was unusual or different or sinful, which we know now did not come until European colonization, Christian and Islamic missionary work. So now I am reading from a chapter where one of those queer characters is enduring the middle passage. And Song of Songs. The sun was burning high when they were walked above onto the ship's deck. A strange rotation around the ship, and some of its crew spat on them, laughed, and downed libations. They seemed unaware of their own filth as they pinched their noses and frowned. Some of them held onto guns, others had knives. Kosai looked into their faces. He wanted to understand what they were, see if he could retrieve something from them that could explain all this. He saw pits with hands reaching out of them. He saw little skinless girls lined up to sing. He saw boys running into sea foam, and when they turned to wave goodbye to their families standing on the shore, they had everything except faces. Suffocation was their birthright. Chains rattled, and Kosai and the two others he was linked to shuffled around the deck to the jeers of all. Then he saw him, nearby and partially hidden by the glint of sunlight and the mask of shadow, but recognizable by the tone of his grievances. It was Elewa. In the pit of his stomach, Kosai felt spikes jut out from a sphere. There was a vibration then, which summoned forth the tremors in his entire body, bringing up everything and taking him down to his knees. One of the skinless said something to Kosai in their jackal language, in which everything landed like an insult. But there was another voice coming from that corner of the ship where the sun couldn't all the way reach. It sounded so near, the voice, and yet he couldn't pinpoint its direction. It didn't matter. He recognized its clicks and timbre, its highs and lows, and on them he could climb, reach the frightening heights generally forbidden in the mist and shrouded in treetops. All he needed was a hand, a signal of some kind, a call, permission. In the silence, 7 women, linked by the crooks of their elbows, heads newly shaven and breasts firm. The one in the middle ululated. It had begun. Then Elewa moved closer through the crowd, and Kosai saw that it wasn't Elewa risen after all. It was a boy. He was pale, but not hard, looked younger than Kosai even, perhaps had just reached puberty himself, walking in footsteps twice as large as his own feet. Admirable. Dirty, but it was clear that he was a boy denied the playfulness that all boys enjoyed, to give chase and smile mischievous but harmless things into existence, to pick fruit from trees and stain their hands with the juices, stick a toe in a river and get pushed in by a friend, but only outside the presence of the hippos that ruled the water, watching peacocks bow and preen and walk in circles to impress their betrothed. Someone had denied this boy all of that, had interrupted his flow, dammed it, and replaced it with thorn and dryweed. And it was apparent in the moisture of his eyes, which he wiped away before it had the chance to be a sign of life. Kosai held onto the boy's budding sympathy with both hands, marveled at its shape, rubbed its smooth edges, and let its sweetness dance on his tongue. It was alive, curled into its own warmth and only unfurled slowly like a fist opening onto peace. This was kind, but too late. Kosai had already spotted the pulse of life throbbing in the boy's neck, and this too had it calling, loud and rambunctious, wide open and seductive. It asked for him, and he obliged. He shot up and roped his chain around the skinless boy's neck, then snatched his ribs apart. The boy kicked and struggled and thrashed. Kosai didn't let go. The others began to charge him, but Kosai had already managed to pull himself back up against the half wall of the deck. He took a deep breath and shouted, "This triumph is for Elewa in the name of King Akusa." Then he fell backward over the wall of the ship, the boy in his grasp. With them, the 2 other people chained to Kosai crashed down into the waves, shocked, then comforted by the cold embrace of the water, soothed by the sea foam, and then absorbed. Kosai wouldn't swim. He held on to the skinless boy until his body was still, then he let out his own breath, and together they began to sink. Such a shame, but he had to do it, had to. Pressed into this corner, there was no way he was going to die alone. It had already been determined, they shall die together, for this was glory. Elewa. As they descended, Kosai prayed for forgiveness from the woman and the man who were chained to him. He didn't ask them if they had wanted to drown, but took it upon himself to drag them into the deep, way down, lower now than the bottom of the beast they had dropped from. Maybe this was the sin his father left out of the story, the part about how, in order to survive the mountain people, they had to come down from a mountain of their own, had to wear the remains of some other people's children around their own necks. Victors gave themselves the right to rename murder triumph and adorn themselves with jewelry made from the bones of the vanquished. So this is what it looks like, Kosai said to himself as the shifty, watery light began to fade. The view from the mountain top. It hurts. Then, as the blackness took everything, good.
Just an amazing passage, and of course, in another beautiful point in the book. Well, Robert Jones, Jr., our time has come to an end. The book, of course, is The Prophets. And is it in paperback? It must be in paperback.
It is now in paperback.
Yes. So please feel free to pick up a copy of it at your independent news or bookstore out there. Robert, it's been great to spend time with you. We said in the pre-show that you've never been to Florida, so I want to publicly state you are welcome to come to Florida anytime. Come visit us at the Stonewall Archive. Part of what you've shown in your work is just not your amazing writing, but also the research that you've done as well too. That is an important part of what you've done, and so that's great. And so thank you for your time. I hope to see you here. And it'll also be nice to meet you in person as opposed to doing everything virtually as well too. And for all of you, I want to thank you for joining us. We'll be back on June 1st with our next installment, and that will be with the Guerrilla Girls, activists, artists, and leaders for more than 20 years of trying to show us things that have been wrong with the art world. So thank you all. It's been a great pleasure. And Robert, lovely to meet you. I want to say goodnight to my colleague, Paula Sierra. Paula's back there. Thank you, Paula. And thank you for doing everything. And good night, everybody. We'll see you soon.